All right, so picture this. It's any given decade of the last few centuries. Somewhere, a very educated person is sitting at a desk, staring at a question they cannot answer through conventional means. Maybe it's about disease. Maybe it's about radiation. Maybe it's about what happens to a human body when you do something genuinely unspeakable to it. And they think, well, I could spend years on ethical research design, or I could just find some people who can't say no. Guess which option a disturbing number of them chose? These are real experiments. Documented, funded, and in many cases, officially approved. Let's get into it. Now, the thing about human experimentation is that it has never really been the work of obvious monsters. The people behind these programs were physicians, military commanders, university researchers. They had offices and colleagues, and in several cases, they had families who had absolutely no idea what they were doing between 9 and 5. That is somehow the part that keeps being true across every single case on this list, and it is worth holding on to as we go, because the first stop is ancient Greece, which sounds like it should be the least disturbing entry here. It is not. Back in the 3rd century BC, Greek civilization was having something of a moment. Philosophy, mathematics, architecture. People were genuinely firing on all cylinders and asking the kinds of big questions that built the foundation of modern thought. What holds the universe together? What are the stars made of? How does the human body actually function? That last question belonged to a physician named Herophilus, who had received his medical training in Greece and had then turned his attention toward Alexandria, Egypt, specifically toward its legendary library, which was absolutely stuffed with scrolls and knowledge and the kind of intellectual energy that makes a certain type of ambitious doctor relocate immediately. So he packed up and went. Once established in Alexandria, Herophilus took on a student, a young physician named Iris, and together the two of them set out to do something that had never really been done systematically before: map the human body from the inside. Anatomy as a formal discipline, which sounds great genuinely, except that in order to study the inside of a human body, you need to open one up, and Herophilus had some very specific ideas about how to obtain suitable subjects. The Alexandrian ruler at the time supplied him with condemned criminals, fresh ones, still alive. See, here's where things take a turn. Most people hearing ancient medical research assume the subjects were already dead. Bodies obtained post-execution, dissected carefully, findings recorded. That would have been uncomfortable but defensible. What Herophilus and Iris actually performed were vivisections, live dissections, on conscious human beings, without anything resembling anesthesia, because anesthesia was not a concept that existed yet. Every incision was felt, every cut, every probe, every exploratory slice through living tissue. The victims felt it until they lost consciousness from pain or died from blood loss, whichever came first. And just to make this a little more extraordinary, they did it publicly, in front of an audience. Citizens of Alexandria could come and watch Herophilus work, which, sure, call it public education, call it transparency, call it whatever you need to call it to sleep at night. The man was vivisecting people in front of a crowd and calling it science, and the crowd was apparently fine with that, which says something genuinely interesting about the 3rd century BC that I am not qualified to fully unpack. What Herophilus documented over decades of this work was, in a purely clinical sense, revolutionary. Breakthrough discoveries about the nervous system, the brain, the eye, the reproductive organs. He was identifying structures that would not be formally rediscovered for centuries. The tragedy, if you want to call it that, which feels slightly inadequate, is that all of it was stored in the Library of Alexandria and lost when the library burned. 1,800 years would pass before human dissection became medically acceptable again, and by then nobody had Herophilus's notes. So that is case 1. A man who genuinely advanced medical science by inflicting unimaginable suffering on people who had no choice, documented everything meticulously, and then had it all destroyed by a fire. History is funny like that. The second case requires a small jump forward in time and a significant jump upward in scale. We are leaving ancient Alexandria and heading to the Marshall Islands in 1954, which were, at the time, being used by the United States military as a testing ground for thermonuclear weapons. Specifically, the United States had just detonated Castle Bravo, a hydrogen bomb that was supposed to produce a certain yield and instead produced 2.5 times that yield, releasing an explosive force equivalent to 15 megatons of TNT. To put that in perspective, that is 1,000 times the force of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. 1,000. So that was already not ideal. What made it considerably less ideal was that the Marshall Islands were occupied. People lived there. And while U.S. officials had known the detonation was coming, the evacuation situation had been handled with what can generously be described as catastrophic negligence and what can less generously be described as a deliberate choice. The residents of several atolls were exposed to significant levels of nuclear fallout within days of the detonation. And rather than treating this as a humanitarian emergency, certain officials within the U.S. military and medical establishment treated it as something else entirely. An opportunity. Project 4.1 was added to the existing operation almost immediately after Castle Bravo. The stated goal was to study the effects of significant radiation exposure on human beings. Commander Eugene Okanite of the U.S. Naval Medical Corps was placed in charge, and his first move was to swear everyone involved to complete secrecy, because he was apparently self-aware enough to know that we are using nuclear fallout survivors as research subjects without their consent was not going to play well with the general public. 239 Marshallese residents were enrolled in the study. None of them were asked. Radiation poisoning, it turns out, is not subtle. Within a few days of Castle Bravo, the Marshallese residents enrolled in Project 4.1 began showing symptoms that were hard to misread. Hair loss, significant skin damage, weeping wounds that opened across the body and then, curiously, healed relatively quickly. U.S. researchers noted this as a positive sign. Immediate observations were officially wrapped up after 75 days, with the conclusion that no long-term effects were likely. Case closed, everyone go home, nothing to see here. The people who just absorbed 1,000 times the radiation of Hiroshima are probably completely fine. They were not completely fine. Regular checkups continued for years afterward, because someone apparently thought it would be worth confirming the probably fine conclusion with actual data. What the data showed was, women experienced significant increases in miscarriages and stillbirths. Newborns who survived experienced developmental difficulties, impaired growth, and a disproportionate rate of thyroid cancer. By 1974, 20 years after the detonation, roughly 1/3 of those exposed had developed significant tumors. The long-term effects that the 75-day study had declared unlikely turned out to be extensive, multi-generational, and thoroughly documented in the very records the U.S. government had been quietly compiling the entire time. Marshallese representatives eventually spoke out, accusing the United States of having deliberately used their population as research subjects, that the scope of Project 4.1 was not an opportunistic addition to an accident, but a premeditated experiment from the start. U.S. officials responded to these accusations with the kind of carefully worded institutional denial that communicates everything while confirming nothing. The program remained classified for years. The compensation offered to affected residents was, by most accounts, inadequate. And Eugene Okanite, who had sworn everyone to secrecy and overseen the entire operation, was not prosecuted. He was not fired. He continued his career. That is the part of these stories that becomes a pattern, and it is worth naming it now because it is going to keep coming up. The researchers walk away. The institutions protect themselves. The records, when they surface at all, surface decades later when most of the people responsible are already dead or retired, and whatever accountability follows is symbolic at best. Keep that in mind for what comes next. Because what comes next is the Soviet Union, and a facility that most people have never heard of, which is exactly how the Soviet Union preferred it. In 1921, 1 year before the USSR officially formed, the Soviet Secret Service established what was internally referred to as the camera, which translates with remarkable bluntness to the chamber. Its purpose was the development and testing of poisons, specifically the development of a poison that was colorless, tasteless, odorless, lethal, and completely undetectable in an autopsy. The Soviets had been using poison to silence political opponents for years and had found it effective, but the existing methods were too obvious, too traceable, too likely to cause the kind of dramatic visible death that prompted awkward questions. They needed something cleaner. So they built a lab and started testing. The test subjects were prisoners drawn from the Soviet Gulag system, labor camps scattered across the country, populated by anyone who had, at any point, expressed a thought the Soviet government found inconvenient. These prisoners were administered various experimental compounds without their knowledge, the poisons disguised as routine medication, which, honestly, is the kind of thing that makes you want to refuse any pill that anyone hands you with a suspiciously casual expression. The compounds tested included ricin, which causes severe internal hemorrhaging and a particularly unpleasant death; cyanide, which can trigger violent seizures and cardiac arrest; and curare, a muscle relaxant that works by making you completely unable to breathe while remaining entirely conscious, which is as bad as it sounds. Researchers observed the effects, recorded the results, adjusted the formulas, and ran the tests again on new subjects. Over time, they got very good at it. The standout achievement of the camera's research was a compound designated C2, later identified as caramine choline chloride, which the researchers apparently described as a kind of liquid depression. Unlike the other compounds, C2 did not cause dramatic visible symptoms. The victim simply became weak. Their health declined quietly and steadily. They remained calm, showed no signs of distress, and died within 15 minutes, presenting no toxicological evidence that would flag as suspicious in a standard autopsy. The perfect poison, undetectable, reliable, and by the early Soviet period, apparently in active use. Following the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russian officials publicly stated that the camera had been shut down and permanently disbanded, which is exactly what you would say if you had shut it down and permanently disbanded it, and also exactly what you would say if you had not. Moving on. The fourth case in this collection requires a brief detour through something you may already know, because the United States apparently believed that one notorious unethical syphilis study was not enough and decided to run a second one that was in several meaningful ways worse. The Tuskegee study, which ran from 1932, involved nearly 400 African American men who had naturally contracted syphilis and were then deliberately never treated, even after penicillin became widely available, so that researchers could observe the disease's untreated progression. That one is well documented and widely known, and already correctly regarded as one of the more disgraceful chapters in American medical history. The Guatemalan syphilis experiment, which ran from 1946 to 1948, is less well known and considerably more difficult to sit with, because the Tuskegee study at least involved people who had already contracted the disease. In Guatemala, researchers intentionally infected healthy people. More than 5,500 Guatemalan nationals were involved, including children. Around 1,300 individuals between the ages of 10 and 72 were deliberately infected with syphilis and, in some cases, gonorrhea, through direct bacterial contact with open wounds, or through sexual transmission facilitated by infected sex workers whose services were funded by the United States government. The Guatemalan government granted researchers access to subjects in hospitals, mental institutions, and orphanages. The people inside those institutions were not consulted. The man running these experiments was Dr. John C. Cutler, who had also been involved in the Tuskegee study, which raises the immediate question of who exactly was doing the hiring and what the job description looked like. Cutler kept poor records, relied heavily on anecdotal observations, and appeared to be aware throughout that what he was doing would not survive ethical scrutiny, which is presumably why the findings were never submitted for peer review and were never formally published. The suffering inflicted on thousands of people produced, in terms of verifiable medical knowledge, essentially nothing. One patient's case was documented in enough detail to be read directly from the records. A woman named Berta, a psychiatric patient, was injected with syphilis in February 1948. Over the following months, she developed lesions, skin deterioration, and secondary infections. She was not treated for 3 months after her initial infection. By August, Cutler noted in his records that she appeared likely to die, though he did not record why he believed this or what he intended to do about it. That same day, he introduced gonorrheal pus into both of her eyes and reinfected her with syphilis. Several days later, Berta's eyes were filled with discharge and she was bleeding. 3 days after that, she was dead. Cutler's records continued on to the next subject. The United States formally apologized to the Guatemalan government in 2010. That was 62 years after Berta died on a psychiatric ward with gonorrheal pus in her eyes, administered by a government-funded researcher who then moved on to his next notation. President Obama made the call personally. The Guatemalan government accepted, and that, more or less, is what accountability looked like. A phone call, 6 decades later, to the descendants of the people who survived. Keep that number in mind. 62 years. Because the final case on this list involves a cover-up that the United States maintained for considerably longer about a program that was, by any honest measure, the most systematically evil thing documented on this list. And the resolution, if you want to call it that, was arguably worse than the apology Guatemala received. At least Guatemala got a phone call. This is Unit 731. Unit 731 was a covert biological warfare research program operated by the Imperial Japanese Army during the Second Sino-Japanese War, running concurrent with most of World War II. It was established in 1935 in Harbin, a city in northeastern China that Japanese forces had occupied 4 years earlier. The cover story was that it was a lumber mill. The actual function was the systematic torture, experimentation, and killing of human beings on an industrial scale, conducted by military physicians and researchers who referred to their subjects not as patients or prisoners, but as maruta, logs, because the lumber mill story needed to be internally consistent, and because dehumanizing the people you are about to vivisect makes the whole thing administratively cleaner. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners passed through Unit 731, the majority Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, along with some Russian prisoners, men, women, and children. The experiments conducted on them were not, for the most part, designed to answer pressing medical questions or advance battlefield medicine in any meaningful way. A Japanese professor who witnessed the studies was later quoted describing some of the experiments as having nothing to do with germ warfare or medicine whatsoever. Professional curiosity, he called it. People in professional settings, he explained, also like to play. So here is what playing looked like at Unit 731. Researchers deprived subjects of food and water to document survival timelines. They placed subjects in low-pressure chambers and increased the pressure differential until the subjects' eyes displaced from their skulls. They injected subjects with animal blood to observe the reaction. They hung subjects upside down to document how long it took to die in that position. They drained subjects of blood incrementally, studying blood loss thresholds in real time. Some subjects were dehydrated in front of industrial fans until, at the time of death, they weighed approximately 20% of their original body weight, effectively mummified while still alive. Female subjects were forcibly impregnated, infected with diseases, administered experimental drugs, and in some cases, vivisected while pregnant, so that researchers could examine the effect on the fetus directly. There are more experiments. there are significantly more experiments. If you want the full inventory, it is documented and publicly available, and I would genuinely encourage you to look it up, with the caveat that it is substantially worse than what is on this list, and this list is already not easy reading. As Soviet forces advanced at the end of the war, Japanese officials ordered all remaining prisoners in Unit 731 executed. The facility was demolished. Evidence was destroyed. When the United States subsequently discovered what had happened, through fragments of evidence that had survived the demolition, American officials pressured Japanese military leaders and scientists into full disclosure under a straightforward threat: cooperate or be handed to the Soviets for trial. The Japanese cooperated. The United States then reviewed the complete record of what Unit 731 had done and arrived at a conclusion that has not improved with age. The data was valuable. It was, officials reasoned, ethically unobtainable through any conventional means, which was true, because the only way to obtain it was to do what Unit 731 had done. And so, in exchange for that data, the researchers responsible were granted immunity. They were not tried. They were not imprisoned. Several of them returned to careers in Japanese medicine and academia. The United States classified everything and spent decades officially denying that Unit 731 had existed at all. The Soviet Union did pursue trials. 12 individuals were convicted and sentenced to labor camps. 12 out of a program that employed thousands and killed hundreds of thousands. The Soviet trials are, by any accounting, the more aggressive response, which is a sentence that requires a moment to sit with, given the context of what the Soviet Union was simultaneously doing to its own population in facilities like the camera. And that is, more or less, the through line of everything on this list. Not that evil exists. That part is not surprising. The surprising part, the part that does not get easier across any of these cases, is how thoroughly the institutions surrounding it held. The funding continued. The secrecy held. The researchers walked. The records were buried. And when they eventually surfaced, the response was a phone call, or a classification order, or a quiet grant of immunity to men who had supervised the mummification of living human beings for professional curiosity. The monsters in these stories almost never faced consequences. The systems that enabled them almost never changed. That was a lot. Here is something marginally more cheerful. I will see you in the next one.